Good evening, everyone. Hope everyone is well today. In today's live YouTube class, we're going to be discussing real estate contract addendums, such as the HOA rider, the condo rider, appraisal contingencies, and possibly a few other addendums depending on where we're at on time. But we're basically going to be discovering and explaining a bunch of different frequently used real estate addendums to incorporate into your sales contract and basically use them to your advantage and to also help you facilitate your transactions and get to a closing. So let's go ahead and begin the class, and we'll get started going over the addendums. Let's go ahead and open up our screen here. So the first thing I want to take a look at as far as concerning our addendums is, let's go ahead and pull up an as-is contract. So this is the as-is FAR residential contract for sale and purchase. And we could go all the way down to the bottom where it discusses the addendums. Then we could discuss further from there. You take a second to get down there. And then, so here we go. The addenda and additional terms, paragraph 19, line 589, if you're going by the lines here. And right here it discusses the different addendums that you could incorporate into the contract. Some of these are used more seldom than others. Some of these are used quite often. The most common ones that I've seen used, in my professional opinion, is the condo rider addendum, the homeowners association addendum, which can also be called the HOA rider. You could also use the FHA VA financing addendum, appraisal contingency. Those are some of the common ones that I've seen used. A couple of others definitely is the lead paint disclosure for the properties that are built pre-1978. You can have the housing for older persons, also known as HOPA, HOPA. You can have that addendum. That's also quite often pre-closing occupancy, post-closing occupancy. Those are also very common. The sales of buyer's property, another common addendum. From time to time, you see a defective drywall addendum. And also another one that I think is important is the licensee per property interest addendum. You'd use this if the real estate licensee, the most common example for when the licensee property interest addendum is used, as you can see here, it's marked with 2 A's, is if the realtor is also the buyer or has ownership interest in the property. So let's say a lot of times realtors or the buyer also has a real estate license. You would use that addendum to disclose to the parties involved that the buyer is also representing themselves as a licensed real estate agent or real estate broker, and they hold an active Florida real estate license. So that's the purpose of the licensee property interest addendum, is to disclose that the buyer or the seller holds a real estate license. So these are the common addendums. Let's go ahead and start off with the condo rider. We could start there, open up that addendum, and take it from there. So let's get started with that. Pull up the condo rider. Just give me a second here. So we have the condominium rider. So this is the condo rider. It is 3 pages, and we're going to go ahead and start filling it out. And if anyone has any questions, you can feel free to type in the chat to let me know if you have a question about something, and we can take it from there. So to begin, you start off at the top here for the condo rider. You put the seller's name. It's very simple. We'll just put a placeholder here as John Doe. And for the buyer, we'll just put it's another placeholder. Put Billy Bob as the buyer. And then you put the property address. Fairly simple, but don't leave it blank. I've seen many realtors leave this part blank because they feel it matches the contract. If they just put the address, you need to put the seller's full name, the buyer's full name, and the full property address, the house number, the full street name, whatever it is. We're just going to put a placeholder here, placeholder Happy Street. Then you want to put the full city and state and the full zip code. If your property doesn't have a full address, put the legal description here, but in most situations, if it's a condo rider you're filling out, it should have a full property address. You want to put the unit number in here too, if there is one. So you make sure you put the unit number, you could put number sign 2203, 2205, or you could put apartment 105, whatever it is. So make sure to put the full address. The next part is this document, the buyers and the sellers are going to initial up top here. So you just put everyone's initials up here for the buyers and all the sellers. And then you could go ahead and start filling out these paragraphs. So paragraph 1 here is the association approval of buyer is or is not required. So basically, does the condominium association, do you have to get approval to have the new buyer live within the community? It either is or is not required. In my personal experience, usually it is required for a condominium association, but that's not always the case. It could not be required, the association approval. But for this particular example, we're going to say that it is required, so you check mark the is box. And if it's not required, you would just check mark the is not required. So let's say that it is required, then we move on to the next part is this contract is contingent upon buyer being approved by the association no later than, then you put the amount of days in there. You could leave it blank if left than 5 days prior to closing, which is usually a good amount. You could change it to 3 days. You could change it to 7, to 10, 15. It's whatever you want to put there that's agreed upon between the parties. The parties have to agree to it. So as long as everyone agrees, you could put whatever number there. In my professional opinion, 5 days is good. 3 days prior to closing is good. Normally I just put the 5 here because that's usually a decent amount of time prior to closing. So that means that the buyer needs to be approved by the association no later than 5 days prior to closing. You could change that if you'd like to 3 or 2, however you see fit. The next part to fill in here is within blank. So let's put the 5 there. Within 5 days after effective date, seller shall initiate the approval process with the association and buyer shall apply for such approval. So that means, let's say that at the time of making this live stream, today's the 20th of October. Let's say we had the contract signed today with an effective date of today, October 20th. That means you have 5 days from today to initiate the application process to the association. That means the seller and the buyer should do their due diligence to obtain all the documentation and have the buyer apply to the association to begin the application process. Because some associations, they can approve the buyer in sometimes a week, 5 days, if they work really fast. Other associations, they could take a full month, a full 30 days to give you an approval. Some take less than that, 15 days, 20 days. Some take a full 30 days to give you an answer if they work really slow or they just take their sweet time, for a lack of better words, to get you an approval. So the purpose of this paragraph here and this blank that you're filling in, you could put whatever you want. 5 days it's okay. I usually put within 2 days or 3 days because usually you want to start that process immediately, that the seller and the buyer both do their due diligence to get the application process going for the condominium association approval. So you could put whatever days you want there. You could leave it blank for 5. You could write 10 there, whatever number that's agreed upon between the parties. Just my personal professional opinion, I like to put 2 days. Within 48 business hours is usually a good amount of time to begin the application process. So that's paragraph 1, is basically for the association's approval. And this is how you'd fill it out if it is required. If it's not required, you just click the second box and you can leave the rest blank for this paragraph. So the next part here is the right of first refusal. The association has or does not have a right of first refusal. If the association has a right, the contract is contingent upon the association within the time permitted for the exercise of such right. So the association is basically going to have the right of the first refusal. You can read through the rest of this paragraph, either providing written confirmation to the buyer that the association is not exercising that right or failing to timely exercise such right pursuant to the terms of the declaration of condominium. Basically, does the association have the right or not have the right to first refusal? Basically, to decline the potential buyer. So to answer this question, you would have to basically look into the condo documents, or you could contact the association, ask them if they are required to give their approval, and if they can refuse the approval. So they'll usually answer that question. This is really something you would ask the condominium association, and they'll either tell you that they have or don't have, and you click either or. In this particular example, let's say they have the right of the first refusal to let the buyer know that they're exercising such right. Part B, the members of the association have or do not have a right. If the members do have a right, this contract is contingent upon the members within the time permitted for the exercise of such right, either providing written confirmation to buyer that the members are not exercising the right or failing to timely exercise such right pursuant to the terms of the declaration. So the members, basically you'd fill this out. Same thing with the right of the first refusal. The association and the members of the association. So let's just say they have the right of the first refusal to decline the buyer and exercise that right. If they don't, then you check mark the other box. Part C, buyer and seller shall within 5 days after effective date sign and deliver any documents required as a condition precedent to the exercise of the right, and shall use diligent effort to submit and process the matter with the association and members, including personal appearances if required. You could usually leave this blank. You could also change the date if you want. I always just put in 5 days just to not leave things blank, but it doesn't really matter too much. Basically, it's just after the effective date, you're going to sign and deliver any documents required as a condition precedent to the exercise of the right of the first refusal. What that basically means, to simplify, is if the association or the members of the association have a right of first refusal, they usually have additional documentation that the association provides that has their terms and so forth. So you basically just organize that documentation or have everyone sign it and deliver to the association and give copies to all involved parties. You'd usually get this from the association themselves. That's if they have the right of the first refusal. It should usually be included on the application and the documentation that the seller should have for being for the condominium association. So moving on, the rest of the paragraphs you could read through it, but we're going to go to paragraph 3 here, which is fees, assessments, prorations, litigation. This is where you'd fill in the assessments, also known as the monthly maintenance fees, the monthly fees to the association. The official terms for it is the monthly assessments or quarterly assessments, semi-annually, annually assessments. That's usually what it's called when you're dealing with documentation, but a more common thing for everyday speech is the monthly maintenance fee. So if there's, let's say the condo association, they charge, $300 a month, then you put $300 here, check mark monthly. Sometimes some associations, they don't charge monthly fees. Sometimes they'll charge quarterly. Maybe they charge $900 a quarter. So you put $900 and check mark quarterly. And there are some associations that bill semi-annually or annually. So maybe annually they have a fee of, let's just say $1,100. So every annual period, there would be an $1,100 assessment for the condominium association. But you fill this out accordingly. If it's monthly, you put it monthly. If not, you check mark what's needed. And if there's more assessments, Maybe there's a special assessment, you could put that here too. If more than one association assessment, you could put that here. Maybe there's a special assessment for maybe there was a hurricane, there's some roofing work being done, and every quarter they're charging an extra $250 for the assessment for that. You could put that there. And if there's a current rent on recreational areas, you could put that here too. So on top of the special assessments, if there is any, sometimes there's not, sometimes there is, it just depends on the deal. But you could put it here, mark off how it's paid, monthly, quarterly, however it's paid. And then down here on the second page, part C over here, it talks about special assessments and prorations. Seller represents that seller is not aware of any special or other assessment that has been levied by the association or that has been an item on the agenda or reported in the minutes of the association within 12 months prior to effective date, except as follows. And this is where you could write something in there. So let's say there's $250 quarterly assessment for $250 quarterly assessment for new roof. So you could put that there to disclose that to the new buyer, that this is the special assessment for the next let's say special for the next 36 months. So you could put something like that to disclose it to the buyer. This is just an example. It could be written many different ways, but basically this is where you could disclose that information if there is a special assessment. And then part 2 here, if special assessments levied or pending exist as of the effective date are disclosed above by seller and may be paid in installments, check 1 here, buyer or seller. If left blank, then buyer shall pay installments due after closing. If seller is checked, seller shall pay the assessment in full prior to or at the time of closing. So this is what's to be agreed upon between the parties. It could be different for every contract. You check mark the seller. If, let's say, in this example, there's a $250 quarterly assessment for the next 36 months. That means if the seller's checked, the seller is going to pay that full amount that's due in the next 36 months prior or at the time of closing. They're going to pay that whole special assessment. And that's to be agreed upon between the parties involved if that's something that they're going to do, or if not, then you could check mark buyer, and then the buyer is going to take over all future special assessment payments once the buyer takes possession of the property and closing is complete. Now, I wouldn't say that there's one that's more common than the other. It really just depends on the contract and what the parties agree upon. You could have the buyer take over the special assessment payments, or you could have the seller pay it off completely in full and take care of it on their end. It really just depends. Let's say for this particular example, we're check marking buyer. The buyer is going to pay the assessments after closing. They're going to take upon that responsibility. All right, moving along here. Seller represents that seller is not aware of pending or anticipated litigation affecting the property or the common elements, if any, except as follows. If the seller knows anything about this, such as litigation or anything like that on the property, they could disclose that here. For now, we're just going to leave this blank, or you could put non-applicable here. Either or, usually just leave this part blank. Unless there's something that you need to fill in there. I'm not going to go over this particular paragraph too much because it's very seldom that it gets filled out, but it can be used and filled out depending on the nature of what's going on. Paragraph 5, non-developer disclosure. So this particular, you could choose A or B here. It really just depends. I would read through the paragraphs. I'm not going to really sit here and read through each of these paragraphs, but you could choose whichever one pertains more to what the parties involved are looking to do. I've used both paragraphs. It really just depends. If I give you my personal opinion, what I use more often is probably B. This agreement is voidable by buyer by delivering written notice of the buyer's intention to cancel within 3 days, excluding weekends, holidays, after the date of execution of this agreement by the buyer and receipt by the buyer of a current copy of the declaration of condominium. So basically, you could use this. The buyer is going to receive the copy of the declaration of condominium, the articles of incorporation, the bylaws and rules of the association, and a copy of the most recent year-end financial information and frequently asked questions and answers document, if so requested in writing. So basically, the agreement is voidable by buyer for their intention to cancel within 3 days after receiving everything. But you could choose paragraph A up here. The buyer hereby acknowledges that buyer has been provided a current copy of the declaration of condominium, articles of incorporation of the association, bylaws and rules of the association, and a copy of the most recent year-end financial information. And answers document more than 3 days excluding. So you could choose either or. I usually choose part B, but you could choose part A. Basically, what this paragraph is discussing is the buyer needs to receive all those documents I've just repeated here. The declaration, the seller should provide at the seller's expense. It could be agreed upon in the contract at the buyer's expense, but most of the time, in my experience, at the seller's expense, they provide the declaration of condominium to the new buyer. They provide the articles of incorporation of the association to the new buyer. They provide the bylaws and rules of the association to the buyer. And they provide a copy of the most recent year-end financial information and frequently asked questions and answers document. So that's a lot of documentation. You may want to make a list of these things, but that's about, like 4 different things: declaration, the articles, the bylaws and rules, and the year-end financial and answer document. So it's about 4 or 5 things there. You want all of these things. I'd highly recommend that you make sure the buyer receives all of these documents when you're dealing with a condominium association. They should have access to all. Any owner should have all of these documents for their review. Even if they don't review it, they should have it because they're entitled to these documents. So I would read through each of these paragraphs. You could choose either or, whichever is best for your situation. I've used both, honestly, depending on the property and depending what I'm looking to do or what I'm being provided. So I've used both. For this particular example, let's just go with A up here, that the buyer has been provided a current copy of the declaration. You could also choose B, that the buyer is going to be receiving it. And then as you go down here, part 6 here is the buyer. I always recommend you request documents. So buyer is entitled at seller's expense to current copies of the condominium documents specified in paragraph 5. If the contract does not close, buyer shall immediately return the documents to seller or reimburse seller for the cost of the documents. And then you have the buyer's receipt of documents. Buyer received the document described in paragraph 5. I usually always click this, and then you put the date on here, whatever date they received it. So like I said in paragraph 5 up here, you could choose either A or B. More commonly, what I usually choose is B, but once again, this is just my personal and professional opinion. I choose part B for the buyer. I always click this box that requests the documents. I click this box where buyers receive the documents, and I fill in this date only when the buyer receives all of the documents, everything. The articles of incorporation, the declaration of condominium, the financial sheet, everything. The questions, the rules and bylaws, everything. Then I'll fill this date in here and have the buyers and sellers usually initial next to it. This is my professional opinion on how to fill this out. That's pretty much it for the condo writer. You could fill in this if there's any other parking spaces, garages, or anything other that's The common elements, you can read through this paragraph. It's pretty simple, but you know, if there's parking spaces, garages, maybe there's one parking space, and one garage space. Maybe there's something else in here that's also included. But that would be it for the condo writer. That's how you'd fill it out. And that's my professional opinion on how to fill out some of these paragraph 5 and 6 for getting the documentation. If there's anything that I could say is fairly important in this document is when you're representing the buyer, or even if you're representing the seller, you want to make sure that the buyer receives all of these documents. It's very important that they do receive. Any new owner should have these documents. And if the deal fails to close, then the buyer should return these documents to the seller. The declaration of condominium, you probably want to write this down because this is important when dealing with condos. Always a new buyer, and even if you're taking a listing and working with a seller on a condo, you probably want to get this documentation prior so that you have it prepared when you get an offer and you're going to execute a contract. Number 1, the declaration of condominium. Number 2, the articles of incorporation of the association. Number 3, you want the bylaws and rules of the association. Number 4, you want a copy of the most recent year-end financial information. And number 5, it'll also be included. Number 4 is the frequently asked questions and answers document. So you want all of those things. I'd recommend you write that down. If you want, rewind this live stream when it's in the playback, and you want to make sure you take the note of those things. The new buyer should have copies of all that. And that's your sole discretion and between the parties involved if they're going to choose paragraph A or B here. So that's the condo writer. If you have any questions about it, feel free to reach out. Let's move on to the next addendum. Okay, let's start discussing the HOA rider, HOA addendum. This is for a homeowners association. So there's a difference between the condominium association and a standard homeowners association. A condominium association is for condominiums. It's only pertaining to condos. So usually, you know, condos, whereas a homeowners association, it pertains usually to single family homes. It could be a community of townhouses, villas. Most of the time it pertains to either those three, usually townhouse community or a single family home community. When you're dealing with condos, it's usually a building with multiple units, you know, unit 101, unit 102, those are usually condos. In an HOA community, there could be townhouses, and they could be also represented by unit numbers, but they're townhouses. They're not usually actual units within like the building. They could be attached or detached townhouses. Also, HOAs can be used most of the time in single family homes for a community, like a gated community for single family homes, and so forth. So they're different from condos. Condos are strictly for condominiums. It's much different than a homeowners association. So this is for, let's say you're selling a single family home and there's a homeowners association community within the community, and this needs to be disclosed and used and attached to the sales contract for the new buyer to be aware of, and to make sure you're doing things correctly and in compliance by disclosing this and attaching it to the sales contract. So let's go ahead and begin here. We'll just fill out the stuff in the beginning here, very easy. Seller's name, buyer's name, placeholders that we're going to put here. And then we're going to put another placeholder here for the address. Make sure to put the full address, full house number, full city and state and zip code. The buyer's and the seller's initial up top here, and all them initial up top right in these boxes. And let's get straight into the HOA rider. Name of the community is the first thing you put here. You could read through this paragraph. I'm not going to read through it. I'm just going to skip down to the parts that we got to fill in as realtors. Name of the community. Whatever the name of the community is, you put it here. Let's just put a placeholder. Let's call it Happy Land Community. But whatever the name of the community is, you put it there. The next part. You could read through these first two paragraphs, but the third one here is where we start filling things in. You will be obligated to pay assessments to the association. Assessments may be subject to periodic change, if applicable. The current amount is, you put the amount of the assessments. Now, once again, the assessments is also known as the monthly association fees, monthly maintenance fees, but they're really called assessments. Most of the time, people don't call it that. Not always, sometimes they do, but it can be used as monthly maintenance fees. I've heard monthly HOA dues. It just depends however the individual wants to word it, but for the purposes of the contract, they're known as assessments. And whatever the assessment is, let's say the assessment is, let's say this particular community is charging $150 per month. And you put that there. Maybe they're charging $500 annually. Then you put that there. However it's billed. For the purposes of this example, let's just say it's $150 billed every month. But it doesn't have to be every month. It could be billed quarterly, semi-annually, or annually. It just depends on the association. It could be billed every 2 months. Whatever the association has put together. The next part down here is discusses special assessments. You will also be obligated to pay any special assessments imposed by the association. Such special assessments may be subject to change, if applicable. The current amount is, let's say there's a special assessment for, let's say it's $300 per, let's say semi-annually. Just to do some different stuff here. And let's say that's for damage to the common areas, or they're redoing the community pool. Maybe there's a playground next to the community pool and they're redoing the playground. They're charging $300 semi-annually. Then you put that there, and that's how you put it to disclose that information. Paragraph 6, there may be an obligation to pay rent or land use fees for recreational or other commonly used facilities, and the obligation of membership of the homeowners association. I don't fill this out too often, but if there is like a rent or land use fees, then you'd put that down here too. We're just going to leave this blank and just say that's, for the example of this addendum, let's just say there's no additional rent or land use fees for anything. But if there is something like that, you disclose it here and put the amount and how it's paid here. Then of course you have the buyer's date and sign it down here on the first page. And then let's go to the second page here. Now the second page, it's kind of refilling in the same stuff that you just did up top there. But let's go to this first paragraph. The association approval of buyer is or is not required. Now, some associations, they do require approval to let the new buyer live within the community. Sometimes they don't require approval. Sometimes they're there to just collect the assessments and do what they are to do with the assessments. And they're not really there to scrutinize or give approval if someone can live or not live in the community. But sometimes they are. Let's say for the purposes of this example that the association approval is required. So that means that the buyer is more than likely going to have to apply to the association, go through a whole application process, and get approval from the association to live within the community. This contract is contingent upon association approval no later than once again, it has the 5 days there. You could change this number as you deem fit. 5 days is usually good to me. So you got to get approval from the association 5 days prior to closing. You could change it to 3. 3 to 5 is usually good. I usually leave it at a standard 5, but you could change that to whatever you want. 2, 10, 15. It's up to the parties involved, and as long as they agree upon it. Then this next part, within 5 days after effective date, the seller shall initiate the approval process with the association, and buyer shall pay application and related fees as applicable. Basically is that the seller and the buyer are going to initiate the application process. The seller is going to do their due diligence. The buyer is going to do their due diligence to apply to the association. I don't usually leave this one at 5. I usually leave this at 2 to 3. So I'm going to put 2 here. But that's completely up to you and the parties involved. You may want to change it to 7, 8, 10, whatever the parties and yourself agree upon. My personal and professional opinion, 2 to 3 is usually when I want the buyer and the whole application process to begin. If a contract gets executed, I want this done promptly. I think 48 hours to 72 hours is more than enough time to get it done. So, but that's just my opinion. So that's how you fill out this particular paragraph. If the approval is required, if not, just click is not required and move on. Paragraph 2, payment of fees, assessments, and other association charges. So let's go back up to the beginning paragraph. It's a little redundant, but it is required. So we're paying $150 a month. So $150, per month for, you could just put monthly assessments to, what's the name of the community we put? Happy Land Community. It's Happy Land Community. And then same thing, if there's anything else you put in here, you could put, how much did we say was the special assessment? $300 per, you could put semi-annually. For playground area, you can also put special assessment, either or. You could put special assessment or assessments, either or, and then you could put that there. Maybe if you want, you could fill in extra information on a separate addendum, but you could put the special assessment written like that if you'd like. It is acceptable like this. And if there's anything additional, you could put it in here as well. And then down here, if a special assessment or other investments levied by the association exist as the effective date, once again, you click buyer or seller. Shall pay installments. Do have to click. If seller is checked, seller shall pay the assessment in full. Once again, this is completely contingent upon the parties involved and what they're looking to do and agree upon. If you check mark seller, that means prior or at closing, the seller is going to have to pay the entire special assessment up front. Just pay for the whole thing off. If the buyer is checked, that means the buyer is going to be taking upon the payments and installments. Once they take possession of the property, they close and they're now the new owner. I've seen it done both ways. It really just depends on the contract. For the purposes of this example, we're going to check mark buyer, that the buyer is going to take upon the responsibility of making the payments of the special assessment once closed. And then down here, you just put the company information. If they have a website, you put their website down here. Person of contact, you put their contact person's name, the community name, phone number, email, just the community's contact information. We're going to leave this blank. You've just filled this in accordingly. And that's pretty much it, considering the HOA rider. It's very, I think it's a little bit easier than the condo rider, but kind of similar. You're just disclosing a lot of the important information in here. The condo riders, usually condo associations, there's a lot more, things are usually more strict. It's usually a lot more rules, a lot more documentation. Like you need the articles of incorporation, the bylaws, and so on and so forth. For the HOA, I mean, you'll definitely receive documentation, but in my experience, most of the time the condos are a little bit more, they require a little bit more documentation. So that's it for the HOA writer. It's another important addendum. Let's talk about another addendum, another simple one. We'll go to the forms library here. And let's talk about let's see here, let's pull it up. There we go. The licensee personal interest addendum. So as I was talking about in the beginning of the class, this particular addendum is used when where the buyer or the seller also holds a real estate license. So let's say we have John Doe as the buyer, John Doe is the seller, Billy Bob is the buyer. We have our property address. All sellers and buyers will initial here. This is where everyone puts their initials to execute this document. And then let's say the buyer holds a real estate license, Billy Bob. So you would put Billy Bob's name here. Billy Bob has an active or inactive real estate license and has a personal interest in the property. Specify if licensee is related to the party or is acting as seller and buyer. So you could put is the buyer. Let's say Susan Bob is the buyer, but Billy Bob is the realtor representing Susan now. Let's say Billy is Susan's husband. Then you could write like is buyer's spouse. Or let's say it's the brother or brother-in-law. You could put that there too. Either or works. So that's how you would disclose that. That's it. This is the entire addendum. The rest of this is just a blank page. But that's pretty much it. You're just disclosing who holds the real estate license and if they have an ownership interest in the property or a personal interest in the property. And you'd put that there. So it's basically just disclosing that. Billy Bob is the buyer. Billy Bob is the buyer. Fairly simple. It's a very simple addendum, but if you are a realtor and you are related or if you have a personal interest in the property and you're representing the individual that's involved, that you're their spouse, they're or related to them, or you have an ownership interest in the property, a personal interest in the property, then you could you'd use this addendum to disclose that. So let's go back to the blank forms. Let's look up maybe one more addendum that we could go over. Here, we could go over the addendum to contract. This is just a standard addendum to contract. You could put this addendum number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, however many addendums that you need to make. Let's just say this is the first addendum, wherever the contract, let's say the contract was signed on the 12th of October, last week sometime. Seller, buyer, address. And then down here, seller and buyer make the following terms and conditions part of the contract. And you'd write any additions or anything in here. I'm not going to really write anything in here because there could be many different things that could be written into an addendum to contract. The one thing I will say, if you're going to be using this and writing an addendum, whatever you do, try to keep it as simple and as clear as possible. Don't try to be writing something that takes up multiple paragraphs, multiple sentences, starts getting complex, confusing, and you want to use the most simple, direct language possible. That's the best advice I could give you. I'm not going to write anything in here or any examples, but you want to just keep in mind, and if you're a part of our brokerage, you could contact me, your broker, or if you're in another company, you're just here attending the class, contact your broker to make sure everything's looking good. The best advice I could give you as far as right now is keep things extremely simple, use the least amount of sentences, the least amount of words as possible, and get straight to the point, and make sure whatever you're saying is very clear, so that it's very simple. Something can't be argued. You don't want to use vague terms, vague language. You want to be very straight to the point and make it very simple. If it starts getting to the point where you start writing like paragraphs and there's a lot of things you're writing in here, you probably don't want to do that. You want to keep things very simple, very, very simple. That's the best advice I could put is for here. Keep it simple, be very direct, and get straight to the point. Use as few words as possible. And that's a few of the common, most important addendums. I hope today's class was helpful for anyone who's viewing it or anyone who's viewing the replay of the live stream. We'll see you next week. We'll talk about a few further contracts. Before I go, our company is Nizz Realty Inc. We're licensed in the state of Florida at the time of this class. We cover the entire state of Florida. We pay all of our agents 100% of your real estate commission. More information about our brokerage can be found on our website, nizzrealty.com. It's in the description below or on the About Us page on our YouTube channel here. We do this live class free for everyone once a week on Thursdays, usually starting at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you like the videos or you find any of our tutorials helpful, please give us subscribe to our channel and give us a like button on the videos. It doesn't cost you a single penny, cost you absolutely nothing to subscribe, but it's very helpful for us to keep creating and giving you new content. So subscription and hitting the like button, the thumbs up, writing a nice comment, it helps out a lot. Other than that, if you're interested in our brokerage, feel free to reach out for a free confidential consultation. Once again, we pay all of our agents 100% of your real estate commission. Your commission's $10,000, you keep $10,000. Your commission's $100,000, you keep $100,000. More information is on our website. We just charge usually a low monthly fee. We also have a no monthly fee plan available if you're not interested in that. So feel free to visit our website or give us a call for a free confidential consultation. Until then, see you in the next class or the next tutorial video. Thank you. Have a good rest of your evening.